things unreal.
It began much like any accomplishment, as a dream.
Living still.
To gain knowledge and understanding.
Making believe it's alive.
To journey from Earth's atmosphere.
I keep on searching the fire.
To a place completely void of it. Space.
Flying through the virtual sky. Skies where no love.
Hey, come on in there. 24 feet. Contact light.
It's an odyssey that has always been fueled by human curiosity and our quest for adventure. And wherever that journey leads us, however far away it takes us, we'll always be able to trace it back to the sliver of Florida coastline where the dream took shape and then took off. The facility, which now launches more rockets than any place in the Americas, was a less complicated place in 1950. Scientists were experimenting with captured German rockets from World War II and figured this unpopulated stretch of beachfront was a safe place to start. In fact, the first rocket launch from Cape Canaveral, called Bumper 8, was a modified V-2 rocket, and the launch gantry was fashioned from a painter's scaffold. The evolving missile ranges nearby became the proving grounds of the Cold War, used to test the heavy lifters of America's Intercontinental Strike Force. A year later, NASA was formed, and the Mercury program brought the excitement and challenges of manned spaceflight to the launch pads at Cape Canaveral. A construction boom quickly followed, spurred on by the challenge of a young president to land an American on the moon in less than 10 years. Cape Canaveral began to appear regularly on TV coverage of the space race and entered the history books as the United States space program ran off a string of firsts and eventually overtook the Soviet Union as the world's most spacefaring nation. May 5th, 1961. Alan Shepard rides his Mercury capsule into history as the first American in space.
1, ignition, lift off. Fire on the network bird, engine lifting, plane nice moving off that red zone.
February 20th, 1962. John Glenn becomes the first American to orbit the Earth during a 4-hour, 55-minute flight.
Godspeed, John Glenn.
March 23rd, 1965. Gus Grissom and John Young launching Gemini 3, the first U.S. two-man space mission. June 3rd, 1965. Launch of Gemini 4. Ed White becomes the first American astronaut to walk in space. December 4th, 1965. Major Frank Borman and Lieutenant Commander Jim Lovell complete their Gemini 7 mission that lasted 330 hours, the world's longest manned spaceflight to date. Early space exploration by Americans left an indelible impression on those who were around to watch it unfold, and it left behind tall reminders of the courage and pioneering spirit of those who led the way. At Kennedy Space Center Visitor Complex, the spacecraft and accomplishments of that era are carefully preserved and readily accessible for new generations of space explorers and enthusiasts. Artifacts include the original Mercury Mission Control Room, the actual capsule from Gemini 9, and dozens of other historically significant spacecraft and spacesuits. More importantly, those early missions gave astronauts the training and spaceflight experience that would be required to take men to the moon and return them safely to Earth. During a presidency that lasted just over 1,000 days, John F. Kennedy set in motion a mission that will be remembered for 1,000 years.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
All right, lift off with the clock.
That challenge came just after America had been in the manned space business for a grand total of 15 minutes, with Alan Shepard's suborbital Mercury flight.
2, 1, 0, all engine running. Liftoff, we have a liftoff, 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
And it was met 5 months ahead of schedule with Neil Armstrong's footprints on the moon and the splashdown of Apollo 11 in July 1969. While the world celebrated America's achievement, it's been reported that a note appeared at the famous gravesite in Arlington. It read simply, "Mr. President, the Eagle has landed." Lyndon Johnson, another president whose name will always be linked with America's manned space program, renamed NASA's Florida launch facilities in John Kennedy's honor just days after his assassination in 1963. In hundreds of thousands of ways, in enormous buildings, in brilliant feats of engineering, in visionary plans for the future, John F. Kennedy's reason for choosing the moon and daring to go there still echoes throughout the center that bears his name. Because exploration of space, by virtue of its difficulty, causes us to focus our abilities and make them better. From 1968 through 1972, Apollo astronauts made the amazing journey from the Earth to the Moon. This building houses their stories and the incredible Saturn V rocket that made it all possible. The Apollo Saturn V Center opened in December 1996 and has since become a must-see for any visitor at Kennedy Space Center, including some pretty famous people, and of course, many of the astronauts who went to the moon in the late 60s and early 70s.
I'm Gene Cernan, commander of Apollo 17, our last manned mission to the moon. There were only 15 of the giant Saturn V rockets ever built, and 12 launched successfully. Only 3 Saturn V's remain in existence. You'll see one of them in the Apollo Saturn V Center.
A facility, a center that indeed does house the spirit of Apollo. Being only a couple miles from the launch site where we left to go to the moon, I think is significant.
There's also a very human side to what began here at Kennedy Space Center 30 years ago. Here's Jim Lovell describing the high point of his experience in space. It wasn't surviving the explosion that aborted his moon landing during the Apollo 13 mission, but something even more memorable.
That would have to be Apollo 8, because we were the first 3 people to see the far side of the moon, which we never see from the Earth. And we were like 3 school kids looking through a candy store window. It was a most miraculous sight. But the high point was when we came around to the other side and saw the Earth come back up again out of the horizon. When you look at the Earth and you think that you can put your thumb up to the window and completely hide the Earth, it gives you a pretty good feeling of insignificance and humbleness. Just to think that everything you have ever known, your home and the home of a few billion other people, is just sitting there like a little ball on a Christmas tree.
20 seconds.
The Saturn V rocket is as long as a football field, the most massive flying machine ever built.
11, 10, 9. We have ignition sequence start.
The relatively small escape rocket on top of the capsule alone had more thrust than the Redstone missile that first lifted the Mercury capsules into space. From the very first Mercury missions through today's orbital construction of the International Space Station, it's a standing tradition among astronaut crews to design a piece of art depicting their mission. and in some cases, each crew member's name. These are worn on their spacesuits along with the American flag, and especially in the case of the Apollo missions, have become a part of the space program's folklore and exploring spirit. Jim Lovell and the crew of Apollo 8 seeing the first Earthrise. Neil Armstrong landing the Eagle at Tranquility Base.
Okay, engine stop. We copy you down, Eagle.
The command module Yankee Clipper on Apollo 12.
Intrepid now, station keeping. Yankee Clipper.
The mission patches were so closely associated with NASA's accomplishments on the moon that they were designed into the Apollo Saturn V Center, which commemorates the crews and spacecraft.
The launch of Jim's Apollo 8 mission is recreated right down to the window-rattling rumble in the firing room theater, the first stage of your experience at the Apollo Saturn V Center. You'll be surprised to discover what a touch-and-go thing that one small step for man really was.
Kennedy Space Center occupies more than 140,000 acres. That's about 220 square miles, or about 1/5 the size of the state of Rhode Island. About 6,000 acres are devoted to Space Center operations. The rest is a wildlife sanctuary. More endangered species make their home here than any other place in America, other than the Everglades. All this wildlife coexists peacefully with the busiest space launch calendar in the world. More than 3,000 liftoffs have occurred here since 1950. It's helpful for visitors to think of Kennedy Space Center as divided into two distinct parts: the industrial area, where the International Space Station is being processed, and Launch Complex 39, the manned spacecraft launching pads and support facilities. In 1981, NASA launched the first space shuttle, the Orbiter Columbia, and ever since, that's been the main activity here at Kennedy Space Center. The shuttle is the most versatile space vehicle ever designed. It takes off like a rocket, orbits like a spacecraft, and comes in for a landing like an airplane. In order to achieve that versatility, the shuttle has four main parts: the orbiter, its main engines, the external fuel tank, and a pair of solid rocket boosters. The orbiter is the space plane where the crew lives and works, and where the payloads are carried. The other parts of the shuttle are there for only one purpose: to get the crew and payload into orbit. The two solid rocket boosters provide most of the power, 6 million pounds of thrust for liftoff. They're 149 feet tall and hold more than 1 million pounds of fuel apiece. About 2 minutes after launch, the boosters detach and parachute into the ocean, where they're picked up by ships so they can be used again. The huge external tank carries fuel to power the orbiter's three main engines. About 8 minutes after launch, the main engine's work is complete. The external tank is then released and breaks up in the atmosphere over the Indian Ocean. Its distinctive color is just unpainted insulation material. NASA found that eliminating the paint job saves 600 pounds that could be added to the payload. So a little more than 8 minutes after launch, the orbiter is by itself, in orbit above the Earth. That's why NASA says it launches a shuttle, but it lands an orbiter. The huge building that dominates the landscape at Kennedy Space Center is the Vehicle Assembly Building, or VAB. That's where we join all the pieces of the shuttle together. It's the final stop for the shuttle stack before its trip to the launch pad. Even in the vastness of Kennedy Space Center, the VAB makes quite a landmark. In fact, you're looking at one of the largest buildings in the world. The VAB is 525 feet tall, and you could easily fit the Statue of Liberty through any of the door panels you see on its side. The VAB was built to assemble the huge Saturn rockets used for the Apollo program, and then it was adapted for the space shuttle. Inside is an immense open space running through the center of the building. That's the transfer aisle, where we stage parts of the shuttle for assembly. There are 4 enormous high bays, and 2 of those are used for assembly operations. On the side of the transfer aisle and the high bays are work platforms that raise from the floor all the way to the ceiling. 70 different sizes and shapes of yellow lifting devices that we call ground support equipment are used. There are also 4 large overhead cranes that can lift between 250 and 325 tons each. There are 3 basic tasks that have to be completed in the VAB. The solid rocket booster sections are stacked together. These are mated to the huge orange-colored fuel tank. And finally, the orbiter itself is lifted from a horizontal to a vertical position and attached to the other pieces to complete the Space Shuttle launch configuration. The handling must be done precisely, as those solid rocket boosters contain highly flammable propellant. Also, the orbiter is covered with thousands of fragile tiles that serve as a heat shield during re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere. Near the vehicle assembly building are the 3 identical tan-colored high bays of the orbiter processing facility. Inside the bays is a honeycomb of work platforms, stacked 5 stories high. Technicians use the platforms to reach, maintain, and inspect the various systems that make the orbiter the most complex machine ever to take to the air. Many of the most critical functions have 2 complete backup systems to ensure crew safety. And the orbiter doesn't leave the building until all those backup systems are working perfectly. Assembly is just one step in getting the shuttle ready for launch, putting 3 million pounds of spacecraft on top of 8.2 million pounds of mobile launch platform. How do you move 11 million pounds of shuttle and platform to the launch pad? A crawler weighs about 6 million pounds, unloaded, and has a surface area about the size of a baseball diamond. A single cleat off its tracks weighs a ton. 2 large diesel engines generate electrical power for the motors that turn its treads. Operating a vehicle of this size takes a highly trained crew of about 20 engineers and technicians. The path that travels out to the launch pads is called the crawler way. It's 130 feet wide, about as broad as an 8-lane highway. To support the crawler's tremendous weight, the crawlerway has 4 layers of river rock, crushed stones, and compact fill going down more than 7 feet deep. There are 2 crawler transporters here at Kennedy Space Center. They are both more than 30 years old, and they've racked up more than 2,500 miles. Directly adjacent to the Vehicle Assembly Building is the Launch Control Center, the electronic brain of Launch Complex 39. It's the home base of a complicated computer system that oversees the entire checkout and launch process of the Space Shuttle. 3 days before liftoff, this is an extremely busy place. That's when countdown for launch starts. About 200 members of the launch team are stationed in the primary firing room, checking and double-checking every system on the shuttle. Kennedy Space Center oversees the launch until the moment the shuttle clears the tower, about 7 seconds after liftoff. At that time, responsibility transfers to Mission Control at Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. Many types of rockets and spacecraft keep the pads very busy at nearby Cape Canaveral. Launch from there aboard Titan rockets were the Viking missions that brought us our first close-up pictures of Mars. The Voyager missions that took a close look at Jupiter and Saturn, and Cassini, which will study the rings of Saturn. But the most anticipated launches, the Space Shuttle liftoffs, occur at Launch Complex 39, where the observation gantry provides an amazing panorama of the launch pads as well as our space history. First up at LC-39 is a briefing film that provides a real insider's look, featuring members of the launch team who recover, process, launch, and fly the orbiters. That's followed by an informative, interactive exhibit area that gives visitors the A to Z on the Space Shuttle and Launch Complex 39. Then it's a short climb up the observation gantry for a 360-degree view of a lifetime. Inside the gantry structure itself sits a Space Shuttle main engine that actually flew on missions. And back at the visitor complex, the popular Shuttle Plaza area provides guests with a chance to climb inside a life-size orbiter mock-up for a look at the crew accommodations and the giant payload bay. The photo spots and opportunities scattered throughout Kennedy Space Center practically guarantee visitors will go home with some memorable pictures. Still, there's nothing compared to the picture taking that goes on every time NASA launches a space shuttle or rocket. It makes for fascinating replays, but it's primarily a serious science and safety procedure, seeing in amazing detail what different parts of the spacecraft are exposed to during the launch process. Here's just a sample of what was recorded from dozens of different camera locations and angles when veteran astronaut John Glenn returned to orbit during the launch of the Space Shuttle Discovery in 1998. From below, from above, from as close to this view from the press site 3 miles away, from west of the launch pad, from south of the launch pad, and even from a camera mounted on one of the booster rockets as it separates from the external fuel tank and drifts slowly down by parachute to an Atlantic splashdown 150 miles away from Kennedy Space Center. When Discovery returned from its 10-day mission, the cameras were out in force for spectacular views of the landing. All space shuttle missions begin at Kennedy Space Center, and unless weather or mission requirements dictate a California landing, they also end here. The shuttle landing facility is located 2 miles northwest of the Vehicle Assembly Building. It's one of the longest and widest concrete runways in the world, and a welcome sight when you're landing an orbiter that's been traveling 160 miles up at about 17,500 miles per hour. The orbiter actually lands like a glider. During re-entry, it has no engines like a regular airplane does, so it can't circle the runway and try again. It has to land perfectly the first time. As each returning orbiter approaches Kennedy Space Center, 2 loud, distinctive booms announce its passage through the sound barrier. To help the pilots navigate, the shuttle landing facility has several systems, including a microwave scanning beam and some visual aids like red and white lights that, when properly lined up, indicate the correct glide slope. The orbiter approaches the runway at a very steep angle, about 6 times steeper than a typical commercial jet. Then, just before it touches down, it flares for landing, actually at about 200 miles per hour.
Main gear touchdown.
Also located at the shuttle landing facility is a tall metal structure called the mate-demate device. It's used to mount an orbiter piggyback on NASA's specialized 747 shuttle carrier aircraft. From time to time, the orbiters have to hitch a ride to California for major overhauls, or back to Kennedy Space Center when circumstances require a landing on the West Coast. The orbiter's not the only bird to call Kennedy Space Center home. Only a small fraction of land at Kennedy Space Center is actually involved in launching or landing spacecraft. The remaining area, over 130,000 acres, is part of the Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge, home to more endangered species than any other area in the United States except the Everglades. There's also a population of about 5,000 alligators and 310 types of birds, including 23 species of ducks. 2 Department of Interior agencies, the National Park Service, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are responsible for the preservation and protection of Kennedy Space Center's outstanding cultural and natural resources and its delicate ecosystem. Here are some of the wild birds, animals, reptiles, and assorted critters you're likely to see. Many are thriving species. Some are endangered. Others have made a comeback, and all manage to coexist with our own species. even as we're drawn to this place to reach higher and travel farther and farther away from Earth. The Space Shuttle has flown over 100 missions and is the present-day workhorse of America's space fleet. But it's also a vehicle that's helping build our future in space. The International Space Station will cover as big an area as 2 football fields when it's fully assembled. So big, it's been billed as the newest star on the horizon, and you'll be able to track it in orbit with the naked eye. It will take several years to complete the assembly. NASA is launching the components in an exciting series of space shuttle missions. The whole story unfolds in amazing detail in the International Space Station Center, including life-size module replicas that give you a real sense of how the space station's inhabitants live and work. The fully assembled space station will measure more than 360 feet wide and have the same volume of livable workspace as the passenger area of 2 747 jet airliners. This is truly an international space endeavor, with the United States, Russia, Canada, Japan, Brazil, and countries from the European Space Agency. Visitors to Kennedy Space Center can actually become part of a mission in the making and watch NASA technicians ready actual components for launch in this huge high bay overlook. But NASA's future plans also stretch way beyond the Earth's gravitational pull to neighboring planets. At Kennedy Space Center Visitor Complex, you can set your sights on Mars and actually touch a piece of it. It's just one of the destinations you can stamp into your own interplanetary passport at the Exploration in the New Millennium exhibit. There's also the fun learning experience of space travel with the Robot Scouts, real trailblazers for human exploration. And where else on Earth would you expect to come face to face with an actual astronaut? Even after 40 years of manned spaceflight, still fewer than 500 men and women total out of today's population of 6 billion have ever experienced the controlled explosion of a launch, the combined terror and thrill of riding a rocket into space, or spent a weightless day or night in orbit. To this day, you're statistically more likely to bump into a Hall of Famer or an Olympic gold medalist than you are an astronaut until you arrive at Kennedy Space Center. The astronaut encounter experience gives all visitors a chance to meet face-to-face, hear firsthand about missions, and ask questions to a bona fide member of NASA's astronaut corps. Other one-of-a-kind exhibitions at the visitor complex include the world's only back-to-back IMAX theaters and the Inspirational Space Mirror, a moving memorial to astronauts who've lost their lives in the quest of space exploration. Kennedy Space Center is a huge self-contained visitor experience, complete with its own transportation system, full-service restaurants, shopping, and all of this is accomplished at no expense to taxpayers. Dollars generated by ticket, food, and merchandise sales completely fund an inspiring and growing number of exhibits and guest experiences. But most of all, Kennedy Space Center continues to offer visitors the chance to get closer to real spacecraft and unprecedented access to restricted areas of NASA's world-famous launch facilities.
Launch control at the Cape. T-minus 10 minutes and counting.
In the Western Hemisphere, the manned departures have every one occurred here. The suit-ups, the tense countdowns, and the holds, the first fiery moments, the bone-rattling rumble, and the sight of Florida's coastline slipping rapidly away in the rearview mirror. Then the amazing sight of orbital sunrises and sunsets, 16 of them a day while traveling in the space shuttle. To walk these grounds, to tour restricted areas of the world's busiest launch facility. To visit Kennedy Space Center is to participate in something bold, big, and beyond us. On the moon, the Apollo astronauts left behind 6 lunar module descent stages, a half-dozen American flags, assorted arrays of scientific experiments, a photo of Charlie Duke's family, Alan Bean's rookie astronaut pin, Dave Scott's Bible, the initials of Gene Cernan's daughter Tracy, written in the lunar dust, and footprints, lots of footprints. The astronauts later recall that their words and descriptions seemed inadequate, that they failed to fully capture the experience for those of us back on Earth. A poet, they said, should have made the trip, or maybe a pilot, like John Gillespie McGee Jr., who wrote High Flight during World War II. Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter's silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds and done 100 things you have not dreamed of. Wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlight silence. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up the long, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the windswept heights with easy grace. Where never lark or even eagle flew. And while with silent, lifting mind I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touch the face of God.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Tower cleared.
Neil Armstrong reporting the roll and pitch program, which puts Apollo 11 on a proper heading.
Gonna get some dust before long. 96 feet coming down at 6. Slow down the descent rate. 80 feet coming down at 4. You're looking good. 50 feet coming down. Watch for the dust. 40 coming down at 2. Looking good. Watch the dust. Coming down at 2 feet. You got plenty of gas, dude. Hang in there. 30 seconds. 18 feet coming down at 2. He's got it made. Come on in there. 24 feet. Contact light.